Hi everyone and welcome back. This is Mindy Eggen for Lawn Fawn, and in today's video we are going to be doing some Copic coloring with the Ocean Shell-fie stamp set to create this underwater scene. The two main stamp sets that I'll be using today are Ahoy Matey and Ocean Shell-fie. I'm going to start off by stamping my images that I want in my scene and laying them down in my MISTI stamping tool onto some Lawn Fawn white cardstock. This is great for Copic coloring images. So once I picked out all of the images that I wanted, and maybe even a few extra, I'm going to stamp them in the Lawn Fawn Jet Black ink, which is definitely a great ink when I want to Copic color my images. So I ink up those images, stamp them down, and to make sure I have a very nice clean impression, I'm going to stamp them twice. There are some images that I needed extra of because I always like to stamp extra, and I'm going to do that with just an acrylic block. So the bubbles, for instance, I'm going to stamp a few of those onto another piece of the Lawn Fawn white cardstock. I'm also going to stamp out some more rocks in both of the sizes. I love having extra because if I don't use them, I can always save them for a later project. Now, there is something I wanted to show you today. This is my little cheat sheet. So whenever I find a color combination with my Copic markers that I like, I create this little swatch. Now, this is very messy. I didn't have this designed to be posted or anything, but you're welcome to use any of these color combinations. And when I'm Copic coloring, I just grab this and look for something that catches my eye or that works really well with the image that I'm going to be coloring. So some of them I do use in today's video. This is a new Copic color combination for me that I'm going to color the octopus with. This is BV23. That is the darkest color and what I'm going to use for the shading. And I'm just adding that on the very edges. Now with Copic coloring, there isn't really a right or wrong. You color what feels good to you. But when I look at an image, I look at what would cast a shadow. So I'm going to have my lightest spot be the middle of the octopus. So his face is going to be the lightest, which means that I'm having the shading on the side of the head. And then wherever a arm overlaps another, that's where I'm adding this darkest color to add that shading. So you kind of want to have in mind, I guess, where you want your light source coming from, either from the right or the left. I generally have my light source coming from the right-hand side. That's just kind of a habit I've gotten into depending on which way the image is facing. But for this one, since the octopus is kind of going to be my largest image and focal point, I'm having that light source shining directly straight at him. Next, I'm coming in with the RV34 and I'm going to blend that out. So I'm coloring directly over that darkest color I just had added. It's not going to show up a lot, but it's just enough to kind of give my little critter dimension. So I'm coloring right over the top of that BV23. I'm going to extend it out just a little bit, having that darkest color towards the bottom of the arms. Then I'm going to come in with an RV32. And then an RV11 will be my lightest color. So each time I'm blending over that line that I had just left and extending it out a little bit. And whenever I'm blending out, I don't want to really leave a significant line. Sometimes in a larger image that can be hard to blend out. So having different lengths of your coloring really helps make that blend a little bit more seamless. And if you're ever not sure how it's looking, just walk away from your project. It really is a great thing to do. Let the ink settle into the cardstock, blend together, and you'll feel a lot better about it when you come back to it. So I'm finishing off here with that RV11, which is the lightest color that I used, and I will have all of the colors that I'm using listed at the top of the screen. Now I did decide to come in with some little dots, and this just adds a little texture to the critter, and I did that with the BV23. So kind of really over all of that shadow area that I had added previously. Now I'll move on to that smaller octopus. And one thing I wanted to point out, and this is my preference, is that the face of the octopus is looking to the right. So that is where I'm going to have my light source. The brightest part of him, or the lightest, is going to be his face. The other side, or the left side, is the darkest. Now, this was an interesting color combination. I have BG09, BG49, and YG06. And what I'll do is take that YG06, go to the furthest right of that creature, and blend it into that lightest blue. And it creates just this really unique color combination that I thought was really fun to have in an underwater scene. So going back over those areas and just kind of blending out between those two blues and then that light green. And then once again, I'll just take one of my dark colors and add little dots to my shadow areas. And this is something you don't have to do. This is just kind of something fun and extra you can do to your images. Then I'll move on to my little goldfish. I'm going to use YR07, YR02, and YR00. My darkest part is going to be to the bottom of the fish. And then I'll move on to my clam. So I'm going to have the darkest area right behind the pearl and then kind of on the sides. And like I said, that's kind of personal preference. I just thought the pearl would be casting a little bit of a shadow, and I'll make the lightest spot towards the top of the clam. And now I'll do some seaweed. So I have G05, YG06, and YG00. And I use the same color combination for all the other seaweed that I had stamped on the previous cardstock. Now for my ship, I have E59, E57, and E35. You can see I'm adding little flick marks, and this is where it's really nice to have your lines not even, because that kind of adds to the character of the ship. So I'm just flicking those darker colors in. And then adding a little bit of color to my posts of my ship. And my blue is a little bit dark there, but those windows you won't really see a lot. And at first I wanted a red flag, but then I decided to make this a pirate ship. So I colored that flag in with a black. And then I'm just using some warm grays to add a little bit of color to the sails of the pirate ship. Now for the camera, I'm really just grabbing any of the colors that I have over on my desk to fill that in. And for the rocks, I'm going to do C5, C3, C1, and then I'm going to add little dots with the C8. And this combination I use for all the other rocks on that other sheet of cardstock as well. Now this one is really fun. These are the bubbles, and I decided to try and do this as like an iridescent. So I have a V01 that I colored towards the bottom of the bubble, and then B000, and I'm starting at the top of the bubble and flicking it into that V01. So that kind of, it's two different colors, and I think it just creates a really unique effect and almost like an iridescent look to it. Then I can line up the coordinating dies to all of my images. I'll hold it in place with some purple tape, or you can use Post-it tape, and I'll run this through my die cut machine. And I'll have to cut my other ones multiple times for the rocks and the seaweed. Now I can work on the rest of my card to create my ocean bottom. So I'm starting off, I die cut out a piece of kraft cardstock using the Stitched Simple Wavy Borders die. And I want to be able to tuck in my seaweed and my sunken ship. So I'm going to die cut out some areas with the sandy beach accents. So just adding a couple of them in there. I'll run that through the die cut machine. And once I have those die cut out, I'll start some ink blending to add a little bit of character and just some color to my bottoms here. So just removing that purple tape. And I am going to be using the Tea Dye Distress Ink and Walnut Stain. And I'll be applying this with a life-changing blender brush. You can use any type of blending tool that you have. This is just one I prefer, so I can kind of have it fade off, whereas that kraft will be the lightest color and my darkest colors of the ink will be towards the bottom. So starting with that tea dye ink, I pick up some of that ink and I brush off onto my craft mat here and then blend onto my cardstock. I'm going to go up quite a ways on this, and then I'll come in with the walnut stain. Now I like kind of tapping that first initial ink off just so it's not so stark. I can always add more ink. It's really hard to take it away if you're too dark when you go towards the cardstock first. So now to add a little bit more to this, I'm just taking that walnut stain. I'm going to just kind of place some onto my craft mat. I'm going to spritz it with water, and then I'm going to pick it up with my paintbrush and flick this onto my background. Now I didn't clean my brush apparently last time very well, and so I have a little bit uh, of the liquid stardust left on here from a previous project. So I actually have kind of some sparkly brown ink on here, which is all good. It works. It's really pretty. So I'm just tapping my paintbrush. I'm going to add those flicks to the background. And then I'm going to take some of the Distress Picket Fence paint, and I'm going to just liquefy that as well with some water, and not realizing my brown was right there. I really wasn't paying attention when I was doing this, but that's okay. I'm going to pick that up. It'll be a little bit tainted brown, but that just matches the background. And I'm going to flick this on for some speckles onto my sand too. So it all worked out really well. I just wasn't paying attention to where I was putting my paint or my ink apparently. So I'll set this off on the side to dry, and then I'm going to work on the actual ocean background portion. Now for this, I'm going to use Speckled Egg, Peacock Feathers, and Blueprint Sketch Distress Oxide inks. And I'm going to be doing this on top of some Bristol Smooth cardstock. If you ever have trouble with blending, I definitely recommend Bristol Smooth. It's just a really nice slick surface. And because it's such a slick surface and my inks have been re-inked recently, this went on super fast and really thick. So just using a foam blending tool, I'm just going to add that speckled egg right at the top. And then I'll come in with the peacock feathers, and I'm going to come in from the side. So you can see I'm adding just really bright, significant strips of color. And then come in with that blueprint sketch. And I'll come back and blend those out. Like I said, because this is Bristol Smooth, it is really smooth. And so it makes it very easy to smooth out those lines and help with that transition. Plus, even if you don't have a smooth transition between the colors, we're going to be adding images on top. So it's going to kind of hide any imperfections that you may have. And it's an ocean scene, so it doesn't have to be perfect. Now, after I have this blended, I'm going to bring in that sandy bottom that I created and just make sure that I can still see all three of the colors. I wanted the dark blue towards the bottom because that to me is where it is going to be the darkest, is towards the very bottom. Then I'm just taking some clean water in a spritz bottle, and I'm going to spritz this onto my background and pick up that excess ink with a paper towel. That just adds the interest to the background, some almost looks like water spots. And now I'm going to bring in the Scene Builder Bayou stencil. And this is going to make it look like seaweed coming up in the background, just kind of a silhouette of it. So I'm going to line up one of the stencil pieces here where about I want it to go, and I'm going to hold it in place with some purple tape from the back. Then I will bring in chipped sapphire, and at first I just kind of dab it to really get that color in there, and then I can kind of carefully blend that in. Like I said, this doesn't have to be perfect. It's just to add to the background to give this card a little bit more character and add to that scene. Once I'm happy with that, I'll carefully remove this, and I'm going to bring in the second part of this stencil. There are some etched lines in here that you can look at to help you line up about where everything is going to go. When I line up the second one, I'm actually going to overlap it just a little bit more than what the etched lines are showing. And mainly just because I really wanted a silhouette to this. I didn't want it to be too fine of a line, so I wanted it to kind of combine a little bit more. So I made sure that the previous inked image I have on there is showing through these leaves a little bit more. And then same process, I'm just kind of dabbing on that chipped sapphire and blending that on, really making sure this is thick and dark. And then once I'm happy with that, I'll remove it, and this gives such a great silhouette image of seaweed in the background. And we don't have to worry about the bottom because we'll be covering that up with our sandy sandy bottom that we created. Now I took all of my images that I had die cut out and I laid them down around my card, and I'm going to just kind of tuck them in about where I want everything to go. This is going to give me an idea of what things are sitting in front, maybe some things that I want to pop up with foam squares. So I'm just quickly going through this to kind of give myself an idea. And as I did this, I realized I didn't have a sentiment ready. So after I kind of tuck everything in and have everything kind of lined up, I'm going to just carefully push this above so I can get some stamping in for a sentiment. Now I'm going to bring in my MISTI tool to do this, but you can certainly do this with an acrylic block. I'm deciding to stamp this in the Lawn Fawn clear ink, and I'm going to heat emboss it. So first I want to prep my cardstock with my anti-static powder tool. This will just help so that the embossing powder should only stick to my embossing ink. And this is the Blue Jay cardstock from Lawn Fawn. So I'm going to ink that up really well. Then I will sprinkle on the Lawn Fawn white embossing powder. Just tap off any excess that may have stuck to the cardstock. And then once my heat tool is nice and hot, I'll go ahead and melt that embossing powder. So this stands out really well against that dark colored cardstock, which I think ties in really nice with my ocean scene. So once that's cooled off, I'm going to just buff over this with a Swiffer cloth. And then I'm going to die cut this out using the Everyday Sentiment Banners set. Now that I have everything ready for my card, I can start attaching everything. And I'm going to use a tape runner, some liquid glue, and foam squares. Pretty much whatever is really in the front is what I would add foam squares to. You definitely don't have to. I just think it's really cool to add dimension to it. Now, as I'm kind of creating my scene here, a couple tips I thought of when I was working on this to do scene building is any small images like seaweed, rocks, bubbles, things like that, I always stamp extra of. That just really helps add to a scene if you're looking to do scene building. I know some people have asked me about, how do you come up with ideas or, any tips on scene building, and that's one of them. It's any of those small elements like that, trees, clouds, always stamp extra of, because then as you're working on something, you can look at a card and be like, gosh, it's missing something. Throw in a couple extra trees, throw in a whole forest of trees. It really does help add to your images. Or like the bayou stencil, adding that as seaweed in the background. You're not seeing it as a focal point, but it just really kind of adds to the character of the card. Another tip I have is Google ocean cartoons, or actually I get a lot of inspiration from cartoons that I see my son watching. So cartoons, or just even going to Google and looking up ocean life and what kind of things. That's where the shipwreck came into play for me, as I see that so much in fish tanks. So that's another great tip if you're looking for ideas. Now, I didn't decorate the inside of the card, but what I am going to do is I'm going to take glitter pen and I'm going to add just a little bit of sparkle to some of the images, the bubbles, maybe some of the seaweed. I really wanted to add a lot of glitter to everything on the card, but I kind of reined myself in a little bit. So just adding touches of it here and there. You could also go over it with some glossy accents, which would be really cool on the bubbles. So I hope this card has inspired you to create and dig out some of your critter stamp sets. And I hope the tips that I've shared along the way also help you in creating your scenes and Copic coloring. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I'll see you next time.